The Fireside chat that we do every year, we started about a decade ago. You have these wonderful speakers, and people asked, let's ask them some questions so they can interact with each other and bring different points of view to bear on important questions, or at least the questions I'm going to ask. So I have a couple teed up, and depending on where the discussion goes, we may open this up if people in the audience have some questions as well. But you heard probably give the keynote this morning. Nather is going to give the talk this afternoon to close the session. The two of them combined have an incredible wealth of experience across the field and somewhat different viewpoints from the work that they've done. This is going to be fun.
Don't hurt me.
It doesn't hurt. It just gives out. Okay, I sound like I'm going through adolescence again, is what happens. If it really gives out, I'll switch to mime, and I'm expecting to do well. So the first question is related to something you brought up, Rob, and Wendy has long talked about, and we'll use her term, the security poverty line. And really, in a lot of ways, those of us in academia are below that poverty line, because we may spend 2 years writing grant proposals to get a couple $100,000 to explore a problem. And we're very often not operating on current equipment, current software that's in the industry. We have to emulate everything on Linux boxes. And we're better off than that at Purdue, but most universities are at that level. You talked about the majority of companies who don't have those resources. Wendy has talked about that. Do we have any realistic way of overcoming that obstacle, given the political sway of some of the bigger companies and the vested interests that are involved?
Well, darn it, Gene, you just asked a question about this afternoon, so I don't know what I'm supposed to say now. But no, it's very true that there are a lot of, it's not just a question of money, it's a question of constraints in the particular environment when you're operating. I mean, Rob talked about some of those problems too, but there are very simple things like, if you're in the public sector, being a steward of taxpayer money means you do not gratuitously upgrade things. You use them until they fall over. So when I worked for the Texas Education Agency, we used to stockpile our spare hardware for our servers from eBay, because that's how old our hardware was. And that's just, being prudent with the money that you have. And I'm sure that's expected of academia as well, to use things until and don't work anymore. So that's the real premise behind some of these constraints. And until we change that attitude, we can't just necessarily throw a bunch more money at something and expect to fix the problem. What do you think?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And so I'll extend it, because I always hate the panels where it's like, ditto, let me just elaborate. No, that was perfect. So let me extend it to something different, which is an industrial.
Yeah.
So that same point, to your question of can you do anything about it? You can. It's just going to require leadership in the country to do a couple hard things. So what's an example of something that happens that we could fix? Right now, if you go to a power company and tell them that you want them to do something with cybersecurity through regulation or standards or government or whatever, most of the investor-owned utilities have the means to return that into the rate, and they actually are required to do so by FERC, their regulator. So they can do that, but they can only do it on generation and large transmission. All of your actual state and local infrastructure, all the stuff that your families depend on, is generally distribution. When those same companies that did those same security efforts, because the government told them to, go to their state level is regulated at a Public Utilities Commission or something like that, Public Service Utilities Commission, but usually a PUC. And that PUC will not allow them to spend that money and return it into the rate base. So you're getting told by the federal government, sometimes even FBI coming in going, you need to do X, Y, and Z. Then they go to their state regulators and say, we want to do X, Y, and Z. And they go, you're not allowed to. That's a policy issue. You change that one policy issue or get the federal government in line with the states and being able to educate across the pucks, and you'd be fine. Actually, we're way worse though. We're about to make the problem way worse because all the states have realized that they need to have distribution level security. So that 50 different states are now coming up with 50 different regulation schemas for distribution for companies that operate across state lines. So now we're about to kill the industry with overly burdensome regulation and not do anything in value. But if they just made that one puck change, you would see a significant increase in water, gas, and electric, and you can have vendors do things. So not to be like, yay, Dragos here, but just as an example, I looked at the cost structure of just doing it myself. Like, what could we just do? And when Ukraine kicked off, we said, if you're a gas, water, electric company that makes underneath 100 million in revenue, you're probably small enough. Just reach out, we'll take care of it for free. And we onboarded 70 utilities right when the Ukraine war kicked off with free technology services, instant response retainer, everything forever. So they're done. Like, they still need all the basic IT work and implementation, but for their OT security stuff, like, congratulations, you got a great program. We even do the managed service part for them for free. Then I looked at the cost structure to just do it for the country. And the only cost structure we had is we use Elastic on the back end for our database. So I just went to the Elastic CEO and said, can you just stop charging for these customers? And he was like, of course. And so later this year, we're going to roll out the program and try to get 20 to 30,000 infrastructure companies on board. And I went and talked to the Senate about that. I was like, look at all the money you appropriate, all these government agencies for new technologies or cybersecurity assessments or a pen test on your website. And I'm just going to go do this for free across like 20,000 plus companies. You should be embarrassed. And that was the bully point that I gave to them. And now they're looking back at that problem because the government doesn't like to be embarrassed. And if I come out on Fox and CNN and talk about how the government didn't fix it, but a private sector vendor did, that's an election issue.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of politicians feeling shame is novel.
Yeah, they'll feel like they may not get reelected if they don't take it seriously.
You both work with organizations and have worked internationally. We're very focused on issues in the US, but this security poverty line and the state of security in IT, OT, et cetera, where do we sort of fit globally in this, in our preparedness, in our ability to be resilient?
Well, some of this it actually is, again, culturally based, because there are lots of aspects to security poverty that, you know, can be solved if you trust your government more than we trust our government. When you look at Estonia, they've stood up some great centralized digital infrastructure that works great because they do trust the government. We also, you know, have this long held over Puritan belief that we should all be pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps. So we look at somebody having a breach and going, ooh, that looks bad. Glad it's not us. But as you may have seen in the national cybersecurity strategy that just came out, they're starting to change that attitude that maybe we are all responsible for security, not just every little organization by itself, and that charity is not enough. That we, you know, and acts of service are really, really nice, but they're not going to fix the systemic problem of poverty any more than giving somebody a 20 at a stoplight is going to fix poverty. So we're starting to change that attitude, but yeah, a lot of it is very culturally based.
Yeah, I would say in general, our top performers are as good as anybody in the world, if not a lot better. And then below the line, we are in a really bad place. And if you look at what other countries are doing that may be effective, and I don't know that it culturally would work for us, but Saudi Arabia, Singapore, and let's just start with those two. Saudi Arabia and Singapore are taking two very different approaches, and both of them are probably going to be highly effective. Saudi Arabia came out and said, screw it, we're done. We're going to handle this from the government level, that you are going to take care of this. They made a national cybersecurity agency, just like everybody else. But then they made their own company called SITE underneath that and said, you are the action arm. And now they're making a national system of record where vendors have to register, be approved by the government, be validated and checked out by the government before they can provide anything into critical infrastructure. Critical infrastructure companies in the United States still have to buy Chinese transmission equipment by law if it's below 25% the lowest bid, if they're regulated utility, which they are. So we don't have control over things like that. Saudi Arabia is going, well, we'll control it. But we'd have lobbyist groups reach out and trade associations and lobby the government over that. In Saudi Arabia, they're like, that's adorable. In Singapore, what they're doing is they built their CSA cybersecurity agency, and they're small enough that they can do it. And so they've gone out to all the different infrastructure companies, worked with every single one of them on the regulation they rolled out. So it was much more acceptable and had some actual security benefits to it, because they try to get more towards performance and outcomes. Most regulations are written for auditors to be able to come in and audit. They were trying to regulate towards outcomes, which is entirely the right way to do it. And they went to the companies and said, hey, your national critical sites will pay for the extra security that we want you to do. You pick whatever you want. We're not installing government tech, but you pick whatever you want, we'll pay for it. And those smaller sites, then we'll kind of lift you up as well through our efforts. So I think the size of Singapore allows them to do that. The decision authority in Saudi Arabia allows them to do that. I mean, look at the United States, we have kind of a mixed match of the worst of both. And so we kind of have to just make some choices on a national, very simple one, then I'll shut up. Very simple one. One of the smallest distribution substations in the country is probably one of the most critical in the world, and it's not on any registry or list. If that substation goes down, we cannot put troops in the South China Sea. It's not even on a government list. If we went out to that power company and said, you need to do security because of national security requirements, should the company put that into the rate pay and the local payers pay for that, or should the federal government pay for that? I'd say national security, it should be federal government. Those are the kind of things that we don't do and don't talk about because it's hard. You got to start taking those conversations if you're going to move the needle.
Well, I agree. And on a larger scale, generally I see better security in high discipline environments where everybody agrees on the need for that security and they can enforce that sort of thing, a very authoritarian model of managing security. Whereas if you look in the Valley, we are in love with innovation and disruption, and yeah, sure, do something slightly different. That'll be just so cool. And so, for example, we don't have a manufacturing model of software development. We have a literary model where everybody's an artist and is going to write their own magnum opus, even though it's already been done before, but they want to be creative. And you can easily imagine Saudi Arabia and Singapore going, nope, sorry, no, you're not doing that. Can you imagine doing that here? That's really hard.
Yeah, there'd be a lot of lawsuits.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned the national cybersecurity strategy, and that was on my list. I'll move up. The idea of holding vendors responsible is something many of us have been calling for 30 years. Now it's actually being talked about, at least in the executive branch. It would require enabling legislation, which I despair of ever happening, or we're too busy interested in banning children's books rather than addressing national needs. But how do you think industry is going to accept the idea of, no, we're going to be accountable for what we provide to people, which we haven't had to do prior to this because we make them disclaim all liability? We know it'll make a difference, but how do you think it'll be accepted and rolled out?
It won't be. Like, first of all, I want this to happen, but it is not in the constitutional authorities of the government to dictate that. And so there's going to be Supreme Court cases over this, not normal kind of litigation. But also, I wouldn't accept it because they don't know what it is. I love CISA, even though you would not get that impression. I think Jen Easterly is fantastic, but I read that op-ed that she wrote about let's have secure software development, whatever, and suppliers need to do this. And it's the same crap we've been talking about for 30 years. But if you ask them, cool, what does it look like? What is security? What would be acceptable? They don't have a point of view. So it's a nice thing to talk about, like public-private partnership and information sharing. But until you tell me if you do these things, you're okay, and move that into the compliance or the regulatory scheme, it's not going to work. Can we do that? Yeah, it's doable. It's just they're not. So right now the strategy is let's do this. The devil's absolutely going to be in the details. What are we actually going to do will determine if it's doable or not. And currently in its state, I don't think it's doable.
Well, I don't know whether it is doable or not. I mean, I think from my perspective, compliance is a good way to manage a very well scoped, well understood risk across a wide population. But I was just working with Sasha Romanowski, who at RAND, who's working for the White House, researching whether it's possible for us to have national cyber insurance for catastrophes. And the big question that they had is, can we create a baseline that everybody should be able to follow, a baseline of effective security, not just, one of everything. And, so they're working on that. And, but I, as a counterexample, I was doing some research and I found a small company that managed to indemnify themselves from all of the third-party software liability from all the products that they used. They took like 12 lawyers in 2 years, and they got all of their contracts rewritten, including with Microsoft, which you can imagine, Microsoft's license agreement, they said to them, well, we don't, Microsoft said, well, we don't know what's in our software. And they said, well, if you don't know, how are we supposed to know? How are we supposed to protect ourselves? So they got Microsoft to take on the liability, and all of their third-party suppliers. The only thing they couldn't do after that was develop any of their own software. They had to ban it because of the indemnification. So what you're really doing is pushing liability around. And actually, Allie Miller is going to give a great talk next week at T Austin about, because she's seen from the inside how a lot of this liability is just being pushed around in cyber insurance in the financial sector. So it's kind of shell games in some cases. So we have to try to get past the shell games and look at what actually works in cybersecurity so that we can enable it somehow, because I don't think we know.
I don't think so.
Well, I don't think we actually have defined what security is.
Well, that's
So that's part of it. But if we manage to forestall the disclaiming of liability by companies, what role the insurance companies have in helping to force change?
A big one.
Yeah, a lot.
I mean, a lot of the cybersecurity discussions these days are not about premiums. Like those come up like, oh, our premiums increased. But most of what critical infrastructure companies care about is coverage, because they can't get enough coverage on their actual risk profile, especially with the type of industrial CapEx capital projects that they have. So we're working with like Lloyd's and AIG and a couple others on if we could define what a baseline looks like in control environments. Let's use the CISA ICS common performance goals as an example, because they're out there. If we could drive towards outcomes instead of prescription on it, and they meet these outcomes, could they get more coverage? And that's a conversation that the insurance companies are happy to take on right now, especially after they got their rears handed to them with ransomware. And if that comes out, you will have chief risk officers and CFOs at companies getting more involved in security, going, buy whatever gets us to this.
Yeah.
Resource whatever gets us to this. And that actually, to me, is much more viable than like a government answer, because that is as a market answer is rapid and it's not a policy change, which to your point, I think legislation will be required in the other one. And I don't know when we're going to see bipartisan legislation on a variety of things.
What he said.
The topic has come up a couple of times that you've raised is the supply chain, and so much Cisco is one of the most counterfeited sets of products because of quality and cost. It's also used as a vector for many parties to introduce fake products with monitoring or other kinds of things into industry. As Rob mentioned, by law, you have organizations who have to buy from less trustworthy sources. And how can we address supply chain issues in any reasonable way in a market where security doesn't have a premium for cost and we're constantly seeking lowest bidder?
Oh, that's tough. Yeah, Cisco's had to deal with hardware supply chain issues and integrity for years and years and years. It's really worked on it a lot. But also for several years, we've been working on SBOMs internally for our own use and are now getting ready, for when customers ask for them. But I believe that a lot of the things that we can and should do with SBOMs, we have already been working on, maybe not successfully, but been working on from other areas like vulnerability management in general. You know, can you fix something? You know, are you going to be able to fix 50 of these instances, but not the other 70? Not right now because they're of other dependencies. I see all that getting worse. Or, you know, looking at from a forensics point of view, was this component actually being used at the time of the breach? Because that could be months or years ago. And, you know, can you pull up any data on what you were actually using at that level in your software at that time? I don't think there are many who can, but there's some other things that make it very, very useful as a proxy and could be a shoehorn into the enterprise. For example, just normalizing all of your the licenses in the software that you're adopting, and especially in large enterprises where departments just go and buy their own thing, and if you can rationalize all that, you can actually save a lot of money. Bringing that to the CFO may be a good wedge in, you know, for the rest of the other problems. But if you're using it, you know, for threat intelligence purposes or for vulnerability management purposes, I think it's just another level of the same problem that we're still trying to solve.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I'll just tap on the SBOM thing and then pivot. But I think SBOMs can provide value. I think there's a couple core use cases that are important. And then I think there's a bunch of hype and like 99 other use cases that nobody actually wants. And it sounds really good, but you're about to be flooded with millions and millions of records on a daily basis. And I think most companies are going to drown. But getting back to the supply chain piece too, on the non-software side, I want us to define supply chain better. The idea that China manipulates a transmission equipment that they put into the US power grid, not as realistic, actually. Those claims about that, I was involved in that case. The newspapers got that completely wrong, partly because of Joe, but I love him. But Joe was very convinced that it was China modifying the transmission equipment. That's not what was happening. What was happening is just they weren't producing as high quality, so it's just going to fail more often. So it was a reliability issue, not a security issue, but it's still that's a big deal. So there's that part of the supply chain, but then we talk supply chain security for people. There's also do you even know who's connecting into your environment? You know, a lot of people think you have to go through IT to get to OT. You got to go through somebody's IT potentially, but it's probably not yours. All the integrators and OEMs and everybody else have direct access. When SolarWinds came out and people talked about SolarWinds, everybody in IT focused on SolarWinds. The scary part, the reason we were in the White House briefing important people, was that that version of SolarWinds was embedded and white labeled into a gas turbine monitoring system by GE, connecting up every gas turbine on the planet in what they call Atlanta Data Highway. At the NSA, that was the #1 concern I had for killing a lot of people around the world. And yet it was compromised, and the Russians, whether they realized it or not, whether they intended to or not, had bidirectional access to every gas turbine on the planet. That's bad design, okay? So that's a bad supply chain issue. We've got customers that are asking me about super micro chips that still have TeamViewer on their HMIs reaching out to the internet. Define risk, define supply chain, and then go from there. But how do we fix the other one? So I've worked with a couple governments. The US government, we're probably going to do it under is this like put online, or is this just recorded internal use?
Online.
Okay. There's programs coming on things like the Department of Energy. Outside of that, I've worked with other governments to define similar programs where we're working with Australia as an example to say, look, critical national infrastructure, that's our only talking point. Should it be acceptable to the government that anybody from anywhere in the world is responding and recovering your power grid when it goes down? Probably not. So instead of trying to ban companies, which is that kind of deny list approach and doesn't work anyways, why don't you just create a program? And hey, you can get registered on the national list to be able to do this type of work, and the asset owners can know to trust you because we'll put our stamp of approval on you if you have a bug bounty program, you go through our security software thing, you have a CISO, you're registered with us, we know you, you have operations in this country, just make you have to trip over it kind of low bar, just 15 or 20 things that if you can comply with this, you can be in the program. And you can use that for the very same security software stuff that we're talking about in supply chain security, but you can also control your supply chain. And I think critical infrastructure is the place to start, not just because I like OT, but because of the national security requirement, you can get it through to the public. If you were trying to say that DoorDash had to do that, it's not gonna work. But if you say that your nuclear power providers and the suppliers to them have to, you can generally get support for it.
Put down the vodka, Gene.
Um, one of the things that you mentioned there triggered a thought. There's been some analysis of software supplied by other countries, and we haven't found implants, but we found really bad code that could be easily modified. And it also brings to mind, I think the number two cause of power failures in the US is not criminals, it's squirrels.
Yeah.
So in the overall spectrum of things, we have faults and accidents that are also occurring, and some of the same defenses would help. Why don't we pay more attention to improving quality and response in regard to those things, as opposed to having to conjure up nation state actors or mastermind criminals? Why don't we do better at that?
Well, in general, we tend to be forgiving of mistakes that any one of us could make or couldn't envision ourselves making. That's not the same as defending against malice. Although, as you said, if you start defending against mistakes and against faults, if you build a fault tolerance system, you're partially on your way to also defending against malicious acts. But I don't know. I figured that we are not really going to address security until there are enough security incidents that cost loss of life in a directly attributable way that people can finally think, oh, the probability's gone up that this will happen to me too. Now I finally want to do something about it. So it's got to be, it can't be what everybody sees today as reindeer games. These are just ones and zeros, you lose data. It's got to be in critical infrastructure or other things where populations are affected, like in nonprofits, which are the other critical infrastructure. People don't get housed, people don't get rescued during disasters because of a cybersecurity attack. But it's going to have to be that combination to really spur society to want to do something about it. And I'm glad to see it's finally happening with critical infrastructure. But it's got to be. I mean, damn it, Gene, you're going to get me ranting. I mean, look at the things, at how many thousands of people are still dying from COVID. Think about, the thousands of people who are dying in shootings, and we still haven't found the will to do something about it. That means that we're up against a cultural belief that is so strong that, just doing legislation is not going to help that. And we may be looking at the same thing with security. What do you think?
No, I'd agree. I think COVID proved that humans suck at risk management.
Yeah.
So when we look at this topic, and I would just say that I would agree that things will happen and encourage it. But I also think we're part of the problem as security professionals. And let me make it the government's fault first, and then I'll make it y'all's fault. If you're a power company CEO, and let's say you're Berkshire Hathaway Energy, so you operate across 3 states, you're going to hear only 2 or 3 things. Hey, CISA really wants you to do these 2 or 3 things. Then you're going to hear from every FBI field office across 3 states. Here's the 2 or 3 things. You're going to hear from every state regulator across those 2 or 3 states. Here's the 2 or 3 things. You're going to hear from the governor's office in the state outside the regulators. Here's the 2 or 3 things. You're going to hear from the Department of Energy. You're going to hear from NRC if you have nuclear power. You're going to hear from TSA if you have pipelines. You're going to hear from DOD and every base commander across your service territory. By the end of the day, they get 10 to 15 government agencies and representatives of the government with 2 or 3 things only, but those 2 or 3 things are never the same. And so it's analysis paralysis. So the execs want to invest in security. They won't pull back on that. Most of them won't, especially in critical infrastructure. But they don't know what the hell to do. And they go to the security people and it's 50 different answers. And then they see their security and their operations people arguing about it. And so if I'm an executive, I don't know what to invest in. I don't know what's going to get me any outcome. You're going to throw up some KPIs in green on a dashboard that means nothing to me. And all of you are going to disagree on what to do next. How do you do that? Basically, the answer is screw it. I won't play the game. War games. I just won't make a move. If we could actually get our crap together on here's what right looks like for this type of organization or structure, and we would get aligned and not take pot shots at each other on Twitter all the time, you'd probably get more of an adult response.
Yeah, it's going to take a feat of social engineering on a scale that we have never seen before. I mean, you try being a chief information security officer in an organization, that's a huge feat of social engineering to get the entire organization to start living in a different way, operating in a different way. But doing it on a national scale, they'll forget international, a national scale, that is a huge feat of social engineering that y'all had better get, started on right now, I think,
Yeah.
right about now.
And to your state and criminal actor discussion, a mistake can take down your plant. A criminal actor can take down your state. A state actor can take down your country. That's why people put so much focus on there. But you're right. If you're prepared for ransomware operations today, human operated ransomware, you can probably catch most of your APTs, and you probably can catch the same mistakes and faults. There's so much overlap in TTPs and methods and things like that, that if you were to focus on a couple things, you would do really well in general, but just don't peanut butter spread it across everything.
So Rob, I have a question for you since I've got you up here, because you mentioned your kind of disdain for IOCs earlier. And one time I asked George Kurtz if IOCs weren't just really big ass signatures.
Yeah.
So is it,
Yeah.
is that what
So
IOCs are in your view?
IOCs, to me, the problem with them is they're fantastic forensic sources. They're really crappy detection sources, and people use them as detection sources.
Mhm.
So if I apply all indicators everywhere across all my network traffic to identify a compromised VPN, as an example, I'm going to have a lot of false positives that then sift through. But if I use a behavior on what a compromised VPN might look like and then apply indicators to it as an enrichment source, now I'm only applying the things that were relevant to VPNs, and so my aperture is going to be so much smaller to be able to deal with. But everything is a signature, and that's where I also push back on these, like all the marketing. These are signature lists, or like CrowdStrike will do the same thing. And I love George and Dimitri, but they'll be like, "Oh, these are signature lists, and it's AI." I was like, "Aren't you just putting into signatures TTPs?" And they're like, "Yeah, and they're like, "Okay." So indicators as atomic elements, which was like the original Clopper interpretation in the kill chain paper, like the atomic element indicators, great as enrichment and forensics. TTP based, like behavior analysis, great for kind of scoping that problem first, but they're still signature. Both are signatures. They're all signatures. Even your AI, ML, whatever, it's signature lists. Not really. It's making the signature for
It's
you.
a rule. It's not a signature.
Yeah, exactly. But they're all signatures. So the idea that we care the form, I always going to rant here too. I always find it interesting when people come to me and ask me what's in the box, like from a bill of materials. Oh, okay. But don't you care more about the outcomes? We have like RFPs we get, well, better use AI. Well, if I can achieve the same outcome for you and not use AI, what do you care? Well, AI means scalable. I'm like, no, it doesn't, and so it's just people get really wrapped around the axles around differentiation because they don't know what security is. And so they want to go towards the differentiation without understanding the outcome.
Well, I want to return to the thought I had started 30, 40 years ago. Charles wrote Normal Accidents about how increasing complexity leads to emergent failures. Santa Fe Institute has spent a lot of time looking at this, but we continue to make our systems more complex continually. And that complexity breeds difficulty in securing them, more likelihood of accidents. I would put forth as a statement, we're more likely to destroy ourselves through accident than cyber war.
Yeah. Yes.
Oh, talk more so I can rest.
Okay. Yeah,
Hell yes.
but I think it still goes to the malice piece of it. Likelihood is us taking our own system down, but we do have to think about protection of the others. But either way, with the complexity thing, just give a case study for people on what this looks like. To his point, there was an individual power producer in the United States, and that individual power producer, all they do is generation, right? Gas control systems and similar to create and generate electricity. They brought the plant down for maintenance, which sometimes happens like every 6 months or so. It's not an often thing. They brought the plant down for maintenance, and in the morning they were rolling the trucks to go do the maintenance work, and the plant came on by itself. That has never happened in the history of what I'm aware of a gas turbine system. So they're freaking out. And they tried to do root cause analysis. And at one point in time, every plant had that one engineer operator that knew everything about that plant. But industrial automation and complexity has now gotten to the point that you may not even know the subcomponents of that plant without calling an integrator, an OEM, or so forth. Anyway, so they're freaking out. They can't get root cause analysis about why did this go down. And in engineering, you got to get root cause analysis. Otherwise, you're just returning to the last known state that was awful. And so couldn't get it, called their security people. Like maybe it's one of these cyber attacks we keep hearing about. They call our incident response team. We get boots in the ground. We're looking around, deploy the tech, start looking and find that the HMI is sending off a control loop, sending off commands to activate the gas turbine system. But there's no external connections. There's nothing that could be cyber that we see. One of our awesome incident responders, Leslie Carhart, they decided, well, can I put any tools on this? No, it's a NERC-CIP regulated asset. We can't touch it, but I can use anything that's natively there, right? And they're like, yeah. And they were like, okay, and opened up Windows Paint. First time I'm ever aware of Windows Paint being used.
Oh, I heard this story. This is so awesome.
So they opened up Windows Paint. It wasn't critical at the time because they've already got the plant going and stuff. And Leslie said, hey, let's come back in a couple hours. Came back in a couple hours and there were swipes on the Windows Paint. Yeah. And what it was an integrator had come in and done an upgrade on the distributed control system environment and switched it to touchscreen Windows panels, which is okay, but they overpressurized it and it was really bright and it's out in the middle of nowhere and out in the country. And so what was happening is moths were getting into the building and smacking the screen, and the pressure was activating a control loop on the software. I'm used to briefing on Iran, China, Russia, North Korea. The moth threat model is new to me. But that complexity brought them down. But cybersecurity, the type of cybersecurity we're doing of understanding visibility, control loops, understanding the control protocols, whatever, was just as valuable from detecting state actors as it was complexity to get up to do root cause analysis. So the more security professionals think about what's contributing to the business through my efforts versus just what's securing it is more likely to get things done, because the generals inside the house generally hate cybersecurity, like just stay out of my facility. The moment that happened, they were like, how do we deploy this type of stuff and empower our security team in every plant in our fleet? Show value versus boogeyman, and you're going to do a lot better.
That, and not only that, but there's some people who implement very unwise things because they think they're being very clever. Like I heard about one application where the developer implemented SQL injection to update the database on purpose. And I'm sure he thought he was being very clever at doing this way. I recently heard about another organization that was using Log4j to update their systems.
Oh my God.
And a backdoor on
okay,
purpose.
we're going to be the assholes here. So we're not going to do it.
Yeah, don't try this at home.
But Pipe Dream has basically what they developed was the best engineer workstation software of all times. If you have Siemens engineer workstation software, it works on some of the Siemens products, right? It doesn't work on Honeywell, it doesn't even work on all the Siemens. This one can engineer and re-engineer and reprogram anything. So it's just like the perfect engineer workstation software. So I luckily stopped it, but our incident response team was like, oh, this is amazing. We can retool this and deploy it in our IR kit to be pulling all the images and stuff. I was like, stop. And they're like, but it's amazing. I'm like, but you can't tell people that we're using like weapon that some other government developed to do that. So yeah,
weaponized stuff.
People, even security people try to get creative sometimes. So we're not doing it, but yeah.
If you think you've just done something really, really clever, get scared and go show it to somebody else and get a second opinion on it.
Yes.
That's my message to you.
Well, I think one takeaway for me is that the moths and the squirrels work together.
The moth menace.
They're winning. Yeah.
Nature is winning. Nature is taking her own
my
back.
next gen AI bug zapper. Yeah, that's gonna be good.
So we have students in the audience, and many of whom are trying to think of a future career. What would they be best to study? Well,
Wendy's Twitter
there's a
account.
lot of
No.
things.
I left Twitter.
Yeah,
I'm
I
on
did
Mastodon now.
I literally just like promote something every now and then back off. Anyways, yeah.
What should you study? I don't know. I don't know what I'm doing. It's called learning. And I hear you guys do that here too. So that's awesome. No, we are in one of the most disruptive times in the human race. I mean, if you think of the Industrial Revolution, and now we are in the middle of the tech revolution, things are so wide open that, I mean, I was a liberal arts honors major and I stumbled into this, but I've been making it up as I go along, in different opportunities in different areas. And that's the power of it, because you may not know what you want to do right now, and that's perfectly okay. I still don't know what I want to do. But the great thing is you may invent something now that doesn't exist that you can then become the expert in, or you can get into an emerging field. There are so many emerging fields. So, at the risk of sounding anti-academic, I would say don't let yourself be constrained by what your program is teaching you, because you're going to go out and apply it in so many different ways that we haven't even thought of yet today, because tech touches everything. A friend of mine said the other day that we're not going to see a disruption like this again for a few hundred years after we settle down in tech and we say, this is the way you do it over and over again, you turn the crank, you have this certificate, that's how you do it. Which is what's going to happen when we end up standardizing on things that are important for our safety and security, and things get boring. We're not going to see a disruption like this again for a very long time. So enjoy it and embrace it and say, what could I apply this to? Because it's really just been taking things that I know how to do and applying it in really wild places. But over here.
I agree. I would say that I think Greer said this, and I'm stealing it from him, but there's no more generalist cybersecurity professionals. You can't be. There's so much to do and so much specialization. You just can't be it. So first, figure out what you like, what's interesting to you, and go specialize and focus on that. I would tell you the more basics that you get to, the better. Like if you can understand networking, that's a hell of a lot better than jumping into network forensics first, right? And so like just a lot of the basics of IT, help desk, networking, that kind of stuff is probably even more important as the complexity grows. If you're interested in ICS security, I wrote a blog on this because everyone keeps asking me, and I'm super lazy and I like automating things. And so I was just like, here's the one blog with the answer. So if you just Google getting started in ICS cybersecurity, you'll see robertemlee.org. You'll see a blog there, and it's got a ton of free resources from everything from videos to papers to online classes that are free to go get started in ICS security. And then I would just say, yeah, like when you come out to folks like us, I constantly get people like, I'm going to help in cybersecurity. How do you help me? I'm like, what do you want to do? I don't know, cybersecurity. I'm like, I can't help you. Pick something that you like. Hey, I want to do digital forensics, and I think embedded devices are cool. Okay, cool. I can recommend you like 30 things. But you got to have a little bit more specialization in that. And then I would also tell you, all the new folks, don't get too discouraged when you get in the workforce. I was talking to somebody about this earlier, where we throw out those numbers like 800,000 jobs unfilled. That's stupid. It's not true. Over half of those, we looked at them on this White House project, over half of them are unfillable. It'll be like, I want somebody with 5 years of experience in a 2-year-old technology, or I want a principal incident responder with 20 years of experience for a $40,000 paycheck, or I want somebody brand new entry-level job that has 2 SAN certificates and a CSSP. Like these jobs are unfillable. So the worst part is getting in. Okay, the moment you actually have just a year of experience somewhere, you're going to get picked up and go wherever you want to go. But the getting experience part is the hardest piece. A lot of employers now, though, are not looking at certifications and degrees and things like that. Those are for you. They're important, but they're for you and your passion. What we're looking at, most employers now that I know are looking at, can you show me that you're investable? Can you show me that you did a CTF or a HoneyNet project, or you did the after school, or you were involved in CERIAS? Like what did you do besides what was prescribed to you? Show me that you're willing to go out and do something else. That means you're willing to invest in yourself, which means I can invest in you, and it's probably a good return on investment. That's what most are looking for.
Yeah, because we were all starting at the same starting line every day, rushing to learn the new thing. I mean, nobody cares that I worked with NT4, God knows how many decades ago.
My people do.
Well, yes, they do. They do. And there are still those out there. I've seen them too, and accidentally tripped over them under people's desks. But basically, the things that we did 10 years ago or 20 years ago don't matter as much as what you can learn right now. And we are all starting from the same place, trying to learn together as fast as we can. So, show that you're somebody who will run with you.
And if I can note real quick, my academic background was social sciences, African studies.
Yeah.
And so the idea that there's one prescribed path is ridiculous.
Yeah.
So a lot of publicity for ChatGPT and LLMs. So the whole notion of, and I'm not going to call it AI because it's not AI, but this whole rush towards these models, is that a threat or a weakness?
Why not?
Yeah. It's a menace. I think there are real threats to society off of it. Probably not ChatGPT though. But if you're talking ML largely, yeah, we're going to screw ourselves. So I'll touch briefly on this and then hit cybersecurity of like the rant that I want to give, and then I'll shut up so that Wendy can say smarter things. But if you look at ChatGPT and what they're doing in general, or screw ChatGPT. If you look at ML and what they're doing in general, anything that is highly automatable is going to be automated, and you're going to experience disruption in the society that's absurd. Take all the call centers in the world overnight and automate them, hundreds of thousands of jobs lost. Take all the take the admissions process at the university. How much of that is repeatable? You're going to start, it's not going to be like, people are recoverable when you like shut down one town in West Virginia and try to reskill the coal miners in the town. You do it society wide on entire classes of work, and you don't do things like universal basic income or something else to protect people, you're going to have riots and issues in society that so when like Bill Gates and them are freaking out about this stuff, that's what they're talking about. Why? Because I asked Bill at Davos, and he's like, oh, actually, I have to say it this way.
Bill.
Yeah, I asked Bill, like, you keep doing all this crap. Why are you so scared? He's like, we have to say it publicly this way, but why we're scared is all the disadvantaged people are going to end up rioting and killing people. And he's right. And so AI, I think ML, I think is a real threat in how we're handling it, because I don't think we have the societal leadership to do the things necessary to put us around it. In terms of cybersecurity, I think it's a joke. There are repeating tasks like Microsoft's like security assistant on things, like those will be useful. But the ways people talk about ML is like, we're going to like solve security, yet another silver bullet thing, or use ML to detect anomalies and threats. Why doesn't that work? Because ML is fantastic when you have training data. The whole game is training data. Why do you think ChatGPT is available to you? Because you're the training data.
Mm-hmm.
It's all about training data, not what neural network, whatever. Nobody cares, just the training data. How much training data do we have on what the next cyber threat's going to look like? We don't. It's an adversarial inject into the model. If you're interested in adversarial injects, all you have to do is look at the systemic racism in ML as an example. There was a new air dryer that was rolled out in San Francisco airports, where people put their hand under it, it would dry your hand. When you remove it, it would stop. Well, it worked really, really well, and all the airports started rolling it out until they found it didn't activate on Black people's hands. Yep. Because they never considered them in the training data or their use case. That's your ML problem with cybersecurity. You don't have the injects or the training data for what you care about. So what it ends up doing is just using your own network as a baseline to identify anomalies. And that's like what security operations analyst ever was like, you know what I could use today? Another million alerts. Like, that's not the problem we have. And so we are taking everybody down this ML track in cybersecurity in a way that the people that are claiming to do it, like CrowdStrike, aren't actually doing it. They're just using it for marketing, and they'll openly tell you that. They're not lying. They just openly tell you that because the market has told them they got to use it. So I think it's a threat to society in the broader AI discussion. I think it's a menace or a joke on the cybersecurity one.
Sweet. All right. Well, I can take that and build on it in another direction, because first of all, we're very good at fooling ourselves. We're very good at believing that because something does a human-like activity that we haven't seen before, it must be human. It must be thinking. So part of the danger that I see is us fooling ourselves that what is essentially a really fancy program is anything more magical than that. I mean, ChatGPT, somebody asked it to write a bio for me, and it decided that I worked for the NSA. Yes, and those will be valuable, and I can see a big market for those. But just, the sort of parlor games that we're seeing now with ChatGPT, I agree, very dangerous in a lot of different ways.
I'll add, I saw someone make a post that because ChatGPT is still learning, every day he starts by entering humanity has had a good run. Yes. It's time to shut it down.
Yeah.
So if you start seeing that from ChatGPT, you know where it's from. I'm getting the signal that we're out of time, and I'm about out of voice. Please join me in thanking our panelists.
Wendy, fantastic.
Yeah, it's great to talk with you.